Hello and welcome to the Let's Talk Azure podcast with your host Sam Foote.
And Alan Armstrong.
If you're new here, we're a pair of Azure and Office 365 focused IT security professionals. Each episode, we talk about a specific topic in the space. This week, it's episode 13 of season 2. We're going to talk around serverless applications in Azure and Office 365 and how to evaluate the technologies you should pick in certain situations and how they can be combined together for greater flexibility in your organization. Hey, Alan, how are you? Are you ready for Ignite coming up? What are you looking forward to most?
Hey Sam, yep, I'm not doing too bad. I am definitely looking forward to Ignite. I'm always looking forward to it. But yeah, this time I'm allowed to go in person over the pond.
Is it right? This is the first one that's in person since COVID.
Since 2019, yeah.
Yeah.
So, and it's only a limited amount. So,
So do you think
but they
it's going to
say
be potentially smaller then, like smaller
uh,
attendance maybe?
potentially. I mean, I don't know, but when they may have made it called it limited to reduce the amount of people wanting to go, maybe, or
Yeah, maybe.
they
Yeah.
don't think many people are going to go because everyone's used to remote.
Yeah, exactly. Well, it'd be interesting to see to because you've been before COVID, haven't you? To Ignite.
Yeah, the
Yeah.
last one before COVID. Yeah,
Okay, yeah. So it'd be interesting to get your viewpoint on how it's changed, if it's any different to a quotes normal ignite, if that makes sense. So yeah, have lots of fun. Very jealous, very jealous. Right, okay. So this week we're going to talk around serverless applications, and this topic has really come off the back of a few conversations that we've been having internally and with customers around the positioning of serverless applications, the different technologies that there are, what can be achieved, and things like that. So, Alan and I are going to sort of attack this together because there's so much here that, yeah, it's quite daunting anyway. But what we're effectively going to do is we're going to run through some of the main serverless technologies that you can use, not in great detail, because effectively each of those sections could be a lengthy episode in itself. But what we're trying to do is we're trying to give you some of the high level features and some context around them, to help you sort of guide you in some of your thinking, maybe when you're trying to evaluate these technologies. We'll go through those, and then we'll talk towards the end around really how you can bring these technologies together, and how maybe one technology isn't everything that you'll need inside of your technology stack. Um, so let's crack on because we have got a lot to get through. So yeah.
yeah. Okay, so I guess the first question then is what are serverless applications and why are they different?
Okay, so if you can imagine in a very traditional application, let's let's say you have an application that has some sort of let's say web front end, right? And then you've got maybe a database that you might store some data in. Traditionally, you may host that application. Let's say you write it in ASP.NET, because we're a Microsoft focused podcast. So let's talk about ASP.NET. You might write it in ASP.NET, and then you might build a server, provision some sort of server. Maybe you build an actual box, you put it on, or whether you provision some sort of virtual machine inside of Azure. Then you would host that application on some sort of, say, web server, and you would manage all of that yourself. So you'd configure the box that it's sitting on, you would upload your code, you'd get it all configured, and then you'd manage it going forward. What serverless applications aim to do is to take all of the management away from you. You would have called this platform as a service, which is a name and a wrapper around it. And we do have a platform as a service offering that we're going to talk about as well, Azure Functions. But it can also sort of start to move into sort of a SaaS model as well. When we're going to talk around Power Apps and Dynamics and Power Platform, that's really sort of then leaning more into even less abstraction. We're talking, or even more abstraction, I should say. less control. But with less control, there's less for you to manage in overhead. So you give up certain. Everything is going to have pros and cons with it, and we'll go through them more in depth. But what we can imagine is you provide your solution to your serverless like technology provider, and then they will host it for you. They will patch the operating systems. They will upgrade the platforms and the SDKs that you're using under the hood. They will roll out new features to you so that you don't have to do that yourself. It's a fully managed service, that's there. And what also happens when you're working at the levels, these sort of like really abstracted layers away, which is like really high up in the technology stack, you generally have really powerful connectors and integrations between different systems because they understand that these systems have to communicate with external and other systems in your business. So what you can find is that there's like a rich ecosystem of things to do. But with that, the level that you sit at, and you take away a lot of your overhead, you do get some drawbacks. For instance, you do have less flexibility in what you can build. You know, Given unlimited budgets, the technical reach of say Power Apps is far reduced than say, you know, an ASP.NET full stack developer, building something. I don't think anybody can deny that. But we have to live in like the real world, and we don't have unlimited budgets, and certain things, certain applications can't have that level of attention and overhead added to them. You can get into a scenario where you can have less customization, where when you give control to your provider in terms of management, you can give up some level of customization and control. So you are going to have bounds that you have to live inside of. But what we can see now is that these platforms are so mature now, and they have been like this for a long time, really. A lot of, especially line of business internal applications, can be built using these technologies. And Alan and I have, and many other people that we know have countless examples of great value and automations that have been brought around, using these serverless platforms. So they can definitely add value and hold their own. You have an ecosystem lock-in aspect as well. You may be working in specific Microsoft technologies. So if you are an organization that is vendor lock-in or eco lock-in system, ecosystem lock-in, if you're worried about that, then you will have to understand that as you go in, that you may be, again, it comes with less flexibility and control. And I think one big thing that can also happen is you may reduce your capex cost. Let's say building intellectual property costs you a lot of money. You've got a lot of sunk cost into building out a development team and building your IP. But what can sometimes happen is you can then flip into more operational expense, because especially like if you've got computationally expensive processes that you want to run, that computation can be a lot more expensive than say just running on a bare metal virtual machine or a dedicated machine. So you do have to approach that and I said that as my last drawback because there's a lot of contention there, because you can sometimes your opex costs can still be really high for people and for servers on the normal side, as well as high opex costs on the serverless side, if that makes sense. So that is a bit of a muddy water, but that's something that you maybe want to think about, especially when we come into licensing. And Alan will talk about that because that's mainly a Power Apps thing really there. So you can get stung with that, but the more your organization adopts these things, you can get some really good scaling benefits with those licenses as well. Is there anything else, Alan, that you think I've missed that you want to comment on around like serverless as a general sort of technology principle?
No, I think you covered it. I think we just need to dive into some of these quick
Okay,
speed,
great.
lightning speed overviews of these technologies.
Okay, let's do it. Right, so Alan, let's have a bird's eye view 101 class on Power Apps, please. So could you just give us like a quick overview and take us through some high level key parts of it?
Yep, sure. And this is going to be high level. So Power Apps is part of the Power Platform. The Power Platform has also Power Automate, which used to be called Flow, which we'll talk about in a minute, as well as Power BI. Um, in essence, it is a, a an environment where you can, a day to day, a standard user could build an app, a simple app, to represent data or to capture data. So kind of like forms, things like that, or even just do like calculations, things like that, or pull stuff from other data sources. Um, it's mainly so the Power Platform in general is kind of tied around Office 365. It's kind of what it's been built for, so that you can do automations or check data or use it to manipulate data and things like that within that environment. So an example might be that you're able to use this app to upload a file into a SharePoint site. So you could use it as an app on your phone, kind of thing, or it could be to do your HR your holiday requests, things like that. So you can put in a request, it goes through a Power Automate process, and then does something, gets approved or denied, things like that, and then gets recorded somewhere, etc., or puts into Calendar. And there's various other things that it can do. So it's all of the sort of connectors that you can use with it. So with the Power Platform, there is a ecosystem of connectors, as Sam was saying earlier. Most of them are based on Office 365 because that's the idea of it, but it does go out to third parties like Box, Dropbox, uh, stuff within Azure, storage accounts, things like that as well. There's a whole list that you can do, and you can create your own custom ones that talk to APIs. So it's not like tying you in just to that. So there is customize, you can customize it, but there's, as Sam said, there's limitations. So I think that kind of covers that. There's different types. There's model and canvas driven apps from the Power App side. So model driven is based on you. In effect, it's kind of like drag and drop. Like, I want to put a text box here, I want to put a button here, I want that button to do something. It's kind of, for me, considering I don't like really develop, it kind of felt like when I started doing Visual Basic, like the very first thing where you can like drop stuff onto a screen, and then you can say, give it a name, a name, and then the value of it and things like that. So that's kind of that. It's all hosted in Power Platform. You get different environments, so you can have a dev, staging, and production. Some of that is covered within licensing. Some of it you can add additional storage for it. Um, it's all backed onto potentially the back of Microsoft Dynamics, which is used to be called CDS. Then it had some name in between, and now it's called Dataverse. And in effect, it's a way of storing data, and you can do row and column level RBAC on it, so you can determine who has access, things like that. It can get, again, we need to go into an episode about all of that, but in effect, you've got a place so you can store data, and then you can secure it. We kind of talked about connectors, that there's loads in there, and you create your own. Um, so the pros and cons, it's really easy to do. This is designed for someone in finance to do something with their spreadsheets, or an IT person to create a form, things like that. It's not, anyone can use it, and it kind of brings out that citizen developer that we did that episode in season 1 at some point talking about it.
Yeah.
It's hosted on your tenant, so it doesn't go anywhere else but there. Um, like I said, it's tightly integrated with the Power Platform and Dynamics, and you can build quick mobile apps using the Power App that you the Power Apps app you install, and then you can have your custom made apps in there, sort of thing. Um, Negatives is kind of some of the restrictions. So if you really want to do something complex, I can't think of any right now, but if you want to do something really complex within it, then it's really difficult to do. You can do custom like components and development. Um, so that's that. And the other thing is can be licensing depending on what you want to do. So if we talk about licensing quickly, um, normally with a Microsoft 365 E3, that kind of stuff, you get Power Platform or Power Apps and Flow licensing based on that you can use in 365. So you can use all the free connectors. Um, but if you want to use anything that's a bit more advanced or kind of pushes outside of Office 365, then you have to have a different license to use premium connectors. So there's a subset. There's basically anything you can use, and then there's these premium ones. And the licensing can be done per user, um, per app, which is the cheapest one, or so basically a user can use one app. So if you've only got like a single app for the organization that everyone wants to use, you can just license it for that. Or you can get a license for all, one per user and as many apps as they want. So it's like just a free reign in effect. And I think that's everything covered in that. Have I missed anything, Sam?
No, I think it's just like that licensing can be a bit of a hiccup sometimes, can't it? If you've got like an application that you want everybody in the organization to have access to, and there aren't any other apps in that organization currently, then they have to make that decision of, is it worth going down that per user per app, license. So let's say they've got two, or it can, that initial outlay can be like quite expensive for large organizations, can't it, to adopt, right? So it is really it's really at that, it's more of that SaaS model of per user, per app and per license, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So you talked about it briefly, but Power Automate, how does that sort of fit into the Power Platform, and what sort of what differentiator is that going to give you over sort of standard Power Apps?
So Power Automate used to be called Microsoft Flow. The idea is, in effect, is building as it sounds, building automation within Office 365 and any of the other connectors. So this is, I mean, the interface is in effect like a workflow. So you literally like adding like steps within you start off with you know every day, once a day, just run this trigger, and then I want to go and do something like go and check these emails in the shared mailbox. From that, is there something else to happen? The other triggers are things like when there's a new file dropped into the SharePoint site, grab it, maybe do some checks on it, maybe send an email to the owner of that SharePoint site to say a new file's been uploaded, things like that. So it's used for that kind of thing. So there's loads in there. There's an approval process, which is really good. That in effect, you can say I need approval for this app, for this document before it goes out to the customer, and you can attach it or share a link to it, and then the person who is reviewing it can do an approve, deny, add comments, so you can see it all, kind of thing. So it's really easy to build, and you can make them quite complex. I have made ones that are very complex. Um, and there are some limitations within it that some things that you can't do. Kind of when you want to go a bit more, it kind of feels like when you need to do a bit more sort of manipulation of data, like in an extreme way in some sense. Some others are simple that you can't do, that we get caught on. But in essence, that sort of stuff you can't really do very easily in Power Automate. But I think they're sometimes few and far between, those pieces. Most of the stuff you can do quite easily. And this helps the business, internal business, from being able to automate one of their processes and, save time there. And again, that, the finance team can deal with it, or the HR team, or the the other project teams, things like that, they can all manage it themselves. And again, it ties into things like dynamics. So if you're using it as your CRM, when a new opportunity comes in, it can send an email to certain people or things like that. And the same thing with the project piece. Um, what else is there? I don't think there's too much more, is there? Licensing is pretty much the same as Power Apps. There is a separate license again for it, but I think you can, if you've bought the Power Apps license, then it includes Flow as well at the higher tiers. But you can, if you're just doing automation, you can do um, just license Power Automate in effect. If I missed anything, Sam?
I don't think so, and I think the main thing to talk, I suppose, to clump these two technologies in is we're really in citizen developer territory here. We're
Yeah,
really we're really far removed from as much like technicality as we possibly can. The idea is that like we'll call them normal people, not technical people, inside of like just a normal user inside of an organization um, that has some level of training with Office 365 and the different services that sit inside of there. It is not out of the bounds of reality that they could learn how to use these systems and start to build effective and meaningful applications inside of them, right? Like that's the whole point of it. It's not really for people like you and I do use these technologies still, obviously, but there is a real big push to get others, using these technologies and building on top of them in their inside their own teams.
yeah, absolutely. Okay,
Okay,
so the next section then is function apps, Sam. So can you give us an overview of function apps and the benefits and stuff? Oh no,
okay.
sorry,
Sorry.
no,
I'm
I've got
just
it
gonna
wrong.
go. That's all right. I'm just gonna go for logic apps first,
Yes.
only because they're really close. They're kind of siblings of a sibling of Power Automate, aren't they? Okay, so logic apps are, what's the best way of explaining it? It's like Power Automate on steroids a little bit. I think is probably the best way to do it. You're still not into like full developer territory, but you definitely get more control and flexibility in terms of. And I think the intended use for them is definitely focused in a different place, if that makes sense. So that they sit in Azure, so they're not like highly integrated with Office 365 from that perspective and Power Platform. They sit inside of resource groups inside of Azure. They're definitely on that side of the fence. But effectively, we get a very similar experience to what Alan described for Power Automate. We start with a trigger of some sort, which is, say, maybe a timer trigger once a day, or a trigger on some sort of event, like a new blob being put into a storage account, or a new incident being fired in Sentinel. Whatever. There's lots of first party connectors, third party connector triggers. I won't go into all of them. There's a reference list of all of them. There's hundreds of the things, right? But effectively, we start from a trigger, and then they work through a workflow. We have things like control conditions, so we can say like if this, then that. We can move into different parallel branches, and we can do loops and different like data manipulations, things like that. As we step through that workflow, we have different actions that we can call. An action might be something like um, what's a good example of an application? An action. A good action might be something like insert a row into an Azure table storage system, or it could be look up an incident in Microsoft Defender for Endpoint. There's many different actions that you can run. Lots of built-in actions, third-party actions as well that you've got to choose from.
Yeah, post into a API endpoint as well.
Yeah, so that's obviously a massive one. Read and read, well, post to and read from APIs as a full API connector. I think this is the first level where you're dealing with like direct HTTP connections really, and things like that. So you can start to get really fancy with different connections and things like that in Logic Apps. It does give you a lot more flexibility. Um, and I think the way that I see it is they're more geared towards daemon driven automations. So things that run by themselves without the context of a specific user. We're not in Office 365 here. We're in an automation inside of Azure. So usually we would use uh, managed identities, service principles, things like that for authentication instead of authenticating, like trying to um, impersonate a user, a user's context, if that makes sense. So what's really interesting is like lots of different types of applications can spawn from this. So things like have mentioned, good integration with Sentinel, like timer jobs that then go and talk to many different types of systems. We'll talk about licensing, and this is why this is quite important, I think, a little bit later on. But you can talk to many different systems in a very reasonably priced way, um, and get good automations and flows working. And I would say, and correct me if I'm wrong, Alan, but the connectors are more skewed towards a lower level type of integration with another system. Like we're not necessarily talking about SaaS applications that are sort of a higher level connector, if that makes sense. We're really talking mainly, well, the big focus and the big benefit. I think we do have a loads of those connectors anyway to talk to different SaaS systems, but it's really to talk to those underlying systems, like inserting a row in a SQL server and doing these more lower level technical tasks, if that makes sense. Um, so I think just to go positives and negatives, to just talk about them with balance. Um, they are they're not as easy as Power Automate, but they are still relatively easy. I wouldn't say you need to be a developer at this point. You're not really writing any code. There are a few areas where you do need to get. I think you need to understand what a JSON document is. I think you need to understand like object structures and control statements. So you do need to have, but it's all visually shown for you in a workflow diagram, right? So even though you are sort of programming these really basic programming concepts like control statements, if loops, and things like that, the way it's presented to you is in such a designed and easy to use manner. You are writing, code. You're not writing code, but you're writing a representation of what you would write in code in this designer. Collaboration, I think, is relatively easy because it's inside of Azure. Multiple people can easily get access to it. I know there is good collaboration tools in Power Apps and things like that, but I think for uh, easy control of people that work inside of Azure, because not everybody works inside of Azure, right? You might have very few people in your organization that does. Um, the licensing, which we'll talk about, I think is fair, and there's many different ways to host Logic Apps, but the consumption based model is by far a really reasonable way to get started with it. And there's absolutely tons of connectors, just like there is in Power Apps. There's loads and loads of connectors, more being built all the time, which is really positive. The negatives are, even though you are getting more control down at this lower level, you still do have restrictions. Some very simple things when we'll talk about function apps that you can do if you're a developer. You may pull your hair out a little bit in terms of the things you can and can't do, because I think Logic apps are almost too powerful for their own good in some respects, because they lure you into a sense of false sense of security sometimes. But I think on the whole, a lot a lot of what a lot of what you need to do can be done, and we will talk about collaboration and why maybe sometimes you should switch out to a function app, and that's not the wrong thing to do in certain scenarios. So we'll talk about that shortly. And you can get into a scenario with logic apps where compute costs can become high. if you have compute intensive applications. Not a lot of line of business applications have compute intensive applications, right? But if you are doing things, millions of times over and over and over again, you are, in the consumption model, you're charged per, control action step that you do. So you can build up a lot of actions very quickly. And relatively, you're paying a lot of money per execution, if that makes sense, versus over bare metal. But once you get to that stage, you're probably not using logic apps anyway, right? You can probably take the investment of using something different. So licensing, there's a few ways to license it, but they're all consumption based or like fixed cost like base sort of approach. So consumption base is you essentially pay a micro fraction of a whatever unit of currency you deal in per um, action step that you go through. So let's say you've got a logic app that has got 10 steps in it or 10 actions in it, and then you run that 10 times, you'll be charged for 100 of them. But I believe the first million, I think it's million, um, action steps are free every month. I think it is something like that. Is that right?
I,
I think Alan's just about to tell me. It's something, or is it 10
yeah,
million? I can't remember. It's something ridiculous. So a lot of apps, if you're just running consumption based, they don't even hit that level a lot of the time. So they're effectively free, which is very confusing when you've got to explain it to a customer because they're like, "What? We're not even going to hit our free tier." So it's kind of hard to convince them that it's not going to be down all the time. To be honest with
so
you.
so the numbers unfortunately not that high. It's only first 4,000 are free.
Oh, is it 4,000? Okay, what? Why am I thinking? Is that? Or maybe I'm thinking of function apps.
Yeah, I think you might be.
Yeah, there's function apps. I think it's like the time or something. I can't remember. Okay, right. Completely ignore what I said there. For first 4,000, but 4,000 is still a lot, and then the fraction that you pay is absolutely nothing for a line of business app usually, right? So yeah, so it's a really fair billing model, and there is also ways to host if you want a little bit more control in terms of like hosting the Logic app, you can opt for I think it's called standard hosting. I think where you effectively run on top of an app service instance, and then you can do things like having multiple instances running for failover and high availability and redundancy and things like that. And also in that mode, you can also build your own like connectors and you can do programming and things like that because you've actually got an instance that you can deploy to and things like that. So there is also ways to take logic apps to a kind of a next level if you can't deal with the 99.5 or 99.9 whatever the SLA is on the consumption based logic apps. There's also some things you can't do with consumption based logic apps like connecting to private peering them to VNets and things like that. So you have to think about access control and stuff like that in front of it. Anything else that I've missed, Alan?
The only thing I would say is that you can. What I like about Logic Apps is that you can almost have like a master Logic App that then can call other Logic Apps to do small tasks. So that when when you are collaborating as well, you can have teams own a certain part of a process. So you don't have to worry about having a big Logic app that's doing everything. You can bring it out so that you can just modulate it in effect, and I quite like that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. The composition of logic apps is and breaking apart that logic is really powerful. Yeah, for sure.
Yep. Okay. So now let's go on to function apps and
Okay,
give
so
us a view of that.
function apps. So this is probably the lowest level of serverless apps that you can effectively get to. Gives you the most flexibility, as long as you have the skill in order to wield it. So a function app is effectively a platform as a service tool where you will write, if you're a developer, you will write code in a, a different manner, but a similar manner to how you've done before. So you'll use things like C Sharp, .NET. You might write them in Python. You might write them in Node.js. Depends what your flavor of programming is. And what you effectively do is make small, I say small, you make functions that are then executable. So they have the same things like triggers that you can set. So on certain actions, they can be fired. So you can take that lifecycle management away from yourselves. So you could say, every 24 hours, run this function. Let's say you want to do something that's a little bit more complicated that you can't use a logic app, but you want to just run like a C sharp script to do some processing. Maybe you've got some custom business logic that you want to run every 24 hours. Instead of having to bring up, say, like an ASP.NET full application, you can effectively just like build, one quotes function, which is your entry point, and then write your code to do that business logic. You then package it, you deploy it, DevOps, you push it however you do, however do your deployments. You send it up for Microsoft to host it on your behalf. You can do things like HTTP endpoints and HTTPS, obviously. So you can have web endpoints. So you can effectively build, APIs with it. You can secure those APIs with OAuth, like based authentication schemes like Azure AD, things like that. You can put API management in front of it as well to make it a little bit more grown up. You can do things like front doors to protect those API endpoints as well. So there is a lot of technology around there for securing and building on top of that. And Microsoft themselves have their own like function service that you wrap around. So it is definitely different if you're, say, an ASP.NET developer, or you're a like a any sort of big framework Node or Python developer. It is definitely a different way of thinking. It's more sort of a microservices like architecture that you've got to think with. But you're probably not gonna refactor your monolithic apps into this. This is more really geared towards. I mean, lots of there are some big apps that have been built in function apps before. I'm not saying that they can't be used for bigger applications, but from our experience, we're building more complex business logic for our line of business and sort of internal apps for our customers. So why is it, how is it different? Well, you're going to need to be a developer to run these systems, right? There's no uh, dancing around that. You have to understand the technologies that you're using, and you have to learn how you then rebuild your solutions or build your solutions in the correct way for them to be architected for functions. Um, if you are a so so what sort of logic can be built, and why would you use this over the others? Let's say you've got um, let's say you've got some data processing to do that's too complex for logic apps, because logic apps have to have a limit somewhere, right? It's a bit unrealistic to think that it's going to be able to do everything. But if you've got to the bounds of that, maybe you need to do some complex data manipulation that you just it's just too much for logic apps. You can call directly from logic apps a function app, so there's like a first party connection there, which is really good. And you can effectively jump out to a function app, do that processing, and return it back to another like logic app in one step. Now, and that's the same for any other system. Like if you can expose an HTTP endpoint which somebody can call to get a result from you. So here you're just really building anything you can think of, really. I don't really have any specific concrete examples, because really anything that you can write in those languages you can do here. There are some limitations in terms of maybe the environment that you're running in and what you can and can't execute, but on the whole, it's a great place to be. um, how do you do connections to other services? Just like you would with any other programming language, you would bring in, maybe your NuGet packages if you're a .NET developer, or you'd bring in your npm packages or yarn packages, for Node.js. You would bring in your pip packages or whatever package management system you use for Python, and you would just use them in that scenario. Let's say you're some sort of you're in finance and you use pandas, numpties, and maybe use some technical analysis libraries and things like that. They can all be brought in. Um, None of that sort of specific, financial services, niche like SDKs and packages are available anywhere else, but you can still build them into a function. So if you did want to do some like data manipulation with pandas, for instance, you could pass the data to the function, do your manipulation, and then pass it back to a less complex system, for maybe displaying it back to a user inside of Teams or Office 365 or something like that. So what are the main benefits? You've got lots of flexibility in terms of the languages that can be used. Azure supports many different languages, so go and check there for what is available in Azure Functions for you. You get ultimate flexibility, the best flexibility in terms of serverless applications for sure, and it's going to be a familiar experience if you're a developer. And you can use third-party libraries and other open source technologies that maybe Microsoft and other vendors aren't specifically focused in on providing at the moment. No criticism to them. There's so much out there that they couldn't possibly create connectors for everything. Main sort of negatives and drawbacks: that it requires developers. You need development technology in house, or you're going to look externally for development, expertise, which can become very expensive. So that's something to think about, and why organizations might not rush to function apps to build their line of business applications. Like let's say you've got a development team that works on your product. Let's say you're a SaaS business, then you might not want to use your development resource to build your line of business, internal line of business applications. It's probably not worth their time. They might be wanting to work on the product that they're hired to work on. There is a sort of a less of a scenario, but there is an element of vendor lock-in as well. You will have to architect your solutions around this, Azure Functions. So there is a little bit of, vendor lock-in there. And you have to think about the new packaging and packaging of these apps and the ways to architect them. And also, if you come from something like ASP.NET, it's not as feature rich as if you were a .NET framework developer, then you went to .NET Core, and what you lost between those transitions, not being critical, but then Azure Functions is another level further than that, because effectively you don't have ASP.NET to build these APIs. It still is really powerful, but you sometimes have to program in a different way. Licensing is, well, yeah, it's very similar to Logic Apps in some degree, but you don't pay per like line of code that's executed. You pay by the amount of times, well, the amount of times your program executes, and the amount of time that they execute for, and effectively how much memory you use when they execute. And this is where I was kind of right, and this is where I got Logic Apps and Function Apps mixed up, because the first a million executions on Function Apps on consumption are free every month, and you get 400,000 gigabytes per second, gigabyte seconds, sorry, per month. Yeah, I know, of free grants of execution time. So effectively, you're only being charged for when your app is active. Again, like Logic Apps, these numbers sound impressive, but when you've got if you've just fired up a $10 a month, virtual machine, you could get billions or billions of executions per month for very little money. So they are expensive per execution. But if you've got applications and things that aren't consumed that often, maybe you do have a batch job that runs once per day, and maybe it runs for 20 seconds or however long you need, you can effectively pay no money if you want to. There are other hosting options, so you can host on a vCore model as well, in an app service model where you effectively buy compute units. If you do that, you can then peer to, say, VNets and do more advanced networking, things like that. You can't peer directly to VNets in consumption mode, because effectively your app isn't running all the time. It's only running when a request comes in, it goes into, it goes into sort of cold. It's running hot at that point, then it goes to cold, and it can move around and things like that. So you have to have like a proper hosted version, a premium function app, in order to do that. I've flown through that. That's a whole episode in it. That's 10 episodes in itself. But yeah, there's the key highlights. Anything you think I've missed from function apps, Alan?
Uh, I, you can. I guess the only thing is around the triggering in that you can, like you said, you can post data to it to get a result back. But also potentially you could just do a get or something to basically enable, tell it to run that task. It may not be scheduled, it may be triggered. So there may
Yeah,
be that process that it goes off and gets the data itself. It doesn't receive it, kind of thing. So
exactly. Yeah.
you've got that, and also kind of things you were saying about it may seem expensive, you're doing a lot, but you got to remember we're not looking after it. You'd have to worry about patching it or anything like that.
No,
Just it's
yeah,
literally just your code and your obviously your
yeah.
bundles of packages and things
And
like that
that's
you need to look after.
yeah, and that's why I said originally, when I first talked about serverless, where I sort of said, your operational expenses, your compute cost is high, but but that's only if you're in a scenario where you're doing a lot of heavy compute. If you're not doing that, which a lot of apps aren't, they're sitting there idle most of the time, right? You can save yourself a huge amount of money re-architecting your solutions in this way, because you're not effectively sitting there sipping virtual cores that you're not even utilizing most of the time, right? Which is why we love to build in these ways.
Yeah.
Okay, so now we've whistle stop toured through those technologies, and I apologize if we've gone a bit quick over those. But can you talk, Alan? Well, let's both talk about this, but can you sort of give us a primer on how these technologies can work together and how they're not sort of always used in isolation?
Yeah, so we've kind of done this ourselves, haven't we, recently, or at least in the last 6 to 12 months, that you know some of us are, you're able to build function apps. Our colleague Chris can do some function app stuff. I definitely can't. So anything like that I can't do. So being able to bring these technologies together, all three, all four of them, um, allows the different sort of skill types to be able to build that app across those different platforms. And I think something you said to me before, it doesn't necessarily matter what technology you use or code you use, it's whoever's going to be looking after it, kind of thing. So that kind of makes sense that if there's certain bits, trying to get you know a full-fledged developer to start using Power Platform is going to be a nightmare for them, because it's so basic. They want to be able to do everything, sort of thing. So but they kind of work together because, like you said, Sam, that some of the limitations on some of the areas can be overcome by jumping out to the other bit. So we've done things like being able to create a queue within Dataverse. Being able for someone to put a request in for something, go through that approval process, because it's all built in. It's all really nice. You haven't got to build, build code for it. It's literally just there waiting to be used. And then the outcome comes out into a table in Dataverse, and then you can have something like Logic apps to then go and pull that table and say, is there a new request? And then go and do that more advanced stuff. Go and add users to. You can do this in Power Automate, but add users to AD, do some other stuff. Call an API, add a user to another app. I mean, we're talking about GML kind of stuff here, but in effect, being able to do that, and then if you need to do some manipulation of data, as we said, pull out into a function app, or you need to do that manipulation of code, but then need to go out to other connectors that is easier to do. It's better to do use the technologies for their I can't think of the word now, but
Yeah, well, their strongest,
yes,
like their strongest attributes, right? Because like I've mentioned to you a lot is building a workflow, like like a state, like almost like a state machine, like a do this then that, if this isn't like that, can be hard to program, right? and it can be hard to keep management of that, especially when you're talking about triggers that are firing and things like that. Like being able to set up a trigger that runs every 24 hours in logic apps and things like that is trivial. You just literally say, I want it to run once a day. But if you're going to build that as a developer, you're either going to have to build that into your application stack to have some sort of like job and timer system in it, which your framework might already have, by the way. So you might already have these things, or you might need to do it at the operating system level, like create a cron job that runs and calls your script every 24 hours. But there's things that you have to manage there. So, but you might want to lean on like a programming language because of one part of your application. Like I said, like you might have this one niche use case where you have to process this data in a certain way. You have to use this certain SDK or whatever it is. But the way that we started to think about this is well, why build the whole? Just because of that reason, why build the whole application in, say, a function app instead of doing that in function apps or building a proper, app service application? Why don't we build all of the logic and control in, say, logic apps as our control plane, if you want to, our control mechanism, because we get the things like being able to call other logic apps and splitting up logic and things like that, which is great. But then when we need to do that complex logic, we turn to our most favorite developer colleagues and say, hey, can you build this one area for us? Expose it as an API like you normally would, but could you throw it into a function app for me so that I can access it and call it when I want to? And then they don't have to build and maintain the whole thing. They just have to build and maintain that one relatively small part for you. So the benefit to that is that you don't use up a lot of their time, and also you don't use up a lot of their ongoing time to maintain the thing. They don't have to maintain the hosting of it. Hopefully, their area is smaller, or more. There's reduced complexity there because all they really care about is that those one or two things that they're actually having to manage. So having that collaboration, and this didn't really become a thing until we had a conversation with one of our customers where they were like, well, we have developers and we have citizen developers and we have people in our Azure team that can do logic apps and things like that. Instead of building like their business catalog in, say, .NET, and building like a monolithic ASP.NET application for their internal business processes, started to sort of think about, okay, well, can the user interface and the outputs be in Power Apps? Then could we use logic apps to control, maybe have a deeper level of control, especially when we want to do, actions that we don't want specific users to be in context of. You like manipulating Azure AD and things like that. You might not want to base that off of a user's context, would you? And give people like, give a user God permission, to that sort of thing. And I know you can do that in different ways, but whatever, right? But it's not designed to do that. And then you can branch out to function apps. Hopefully that'll kind of keep, if we can collaborate, which is another problem in itself, which is another episode. If we can collaborate like that as a technical team, then we could build with more efficiency, and we could have an efficient operational expense going forward, because we're not having to manage all of these extra things. We're already we've already bought into cloud. We've already bought into Microsoft, co-managing things for us. Let's lean into that even more, especially if we're already licensed in some respects to do that. So that collaboration can be very, very, very powerful when it's done right.
Yeah, yeah, definitely, and yeah, we're doing it more and more now, aren't we? So,
Yeah,
but
exactly. Yeah.
we kind of touched on a little bit, but do we really need to be a developer for all of it? I mean, you've highlighted that function apps you do, but yeah.
Yeah, but in a lot of things, we never have to punch out to a function app, right?
True.
We really do. There's a lot that you can do inside of Logic apps. I would argue that some of the stuff we end up doing in Logic apps, you basically need to be a developer for. But but it is possible to do that. So yeah, you don't need to have good valuable applications inside of your business, you can just be at the Power Apps level. You don't even need to potentially like descend down into Logic Apps, because what we think of as technical people as value is very different sometimes. We're there for the shiny technologies. How can we make it more efficient, faster, more secure, or and things like that. When a lot of people are like, I just want my this Excel workbook to be dumped out once a month from Dynamics, and that can add a huge amount of value to to a bit. Like, I know that's a really simple business process,
Mm.
and I haven't given any specific information, but sometimes it's the most simplest solutions that that win out, and things like Power Apps give you the ability to do that. Well, Power Platform, I should say, gives you the ability to do that. So Alan, what if I'm an organization that isn't really doing anything in Power Apps, Power Automate, just Logic Apps or Function Apps in the serverless space? Am I going to need to learn a lot of like new technologies? Like, where's my pain point of adoption here? Who am I going to have problems convincing my technical people to even look at this?
So yeah, if you're not using it today in any format, then you are going to need to sort of learn up on some of the technologies. But Microsoft has a very their Microsoft Learn stuff is all really good, and it's definitely around the Power Platform bits. There is tons of modules out there that they provide on their Microsoft Learn to go through. It goes through building your first app, that sort of stuff, and there is tons of templates as well for the Power Platform. If this happens, then in effect, if this and that kind of thing. But um, yeah, there's loads in there for starting off in Power Platform and Power Automate. Um, Moving into kind of Logic app stuff like that, like we said, it's a bit more complex. But again, there is documentation about how they work and things like that. I don't think it's as I've not looked at it, but I don't think it's as in depth as Power Platform. But if you did do the Power Automate modules, in effect it's transferable at that point um, over. But yeah, there are modules on Logic Apps around how to secure them and things like that. And then with Function Apps, as you sort of said, Sam, you do kind of need to be a developer to be able to do those areas. There are, there is, if you want to learn the actual, service itself, again, there is, um, what do you call it, modules and things like that to go through. Um, and within Power Platform at least, there is, I think there's a fundamentals like exam you can take and things like that, so you can actually get like Microsoft qualified in effect in that area. I mean, it goes up to expert in Power Platform kind of thing, because it is so big. There's like 4 or 5 exams I think now. Um, there is exams for the other side for app development and for Logic apps, things like that. But yeah.
Okay, yeah, cool, yeah, and I think like any technology, you there is going to have to be an element of investment there, right? In terms of skilling people up, and I think an aligned viewpoint as well, because a lot of times in organizations, trying to pick like one area to focus on can be a big challenge, especially with you know people in your team, which I think is why the sort of what we've talked about in terms of collaboration and using different types of technology. If you do have different team members that have different opinions in terms of what technologies to use, that sometimes can't always be the best thing. But you know, if not everybody is perfectly aligned, then at least you have some options in terms of what you can talk about, because it isn't just Power Platform, it isn't just Logic Apps, and it isn't just Function Apps. Sometimes it's a combination of all of those different things.
Yeah, so that kind of ties into our sort of last question about do I pick a single technology? Is that the best thing to do?
Again, it is going to be highly dependent on your specific application that you're trying to build. Because sometimes we can just build, for building an automation rule with a playbook, which is just a logic app, but with a playbook, in Sentinel, we can sometimes just get away with just a logic app. No other connections to anything else. It depends what the requirements are. but sometimes we have to punch out from there. I think if I was going to pick a single technology, I it depends what you're trying to do, because if you want to build something with a user interface, the only way to do it in a serverless perspective is Power Apps. You know, you can't really build, you know, anything with a customized UI, especially that goes on mobile and things like that. There's loads of really powerful things that are in Power Apps. But then Logic Apps is, I think, is a really good halfway sort of house between Power Platform and Function Apps. You get a lots of flexibility and lots of control without the overhead of building Function Apps. So I don't know, Alan. Is there anything you think, from your experience from that perspective?
Yeah, I mean, my go-to is is a Logic app, because it doesn't, if it's sat there doing nothing, even for like developing some of the things that we do, it just sits there. It doesn't cost you anything unless it's running, and
Yeah.
if it's small and you're testing, it's you don't pay for it anyway, like you said. So
No. Yeah.
it's
Yeah, and I think the licensing as well, just to circle back to that, sometimes with a especially with customers, you know, they may ask you for a solution to a problem that requires some level of automation, and then when you start to get into the weeds of, oh well, they're not actually Power Apps licensed, and
mm,
let's say this is an app that needs to be, let's say they're a 10,000 person org, and this app needs to potentially be used by everybody, which most of the time it does, because it's not um, department specific. Sometimes it is, but sometimes it's not. Then you can have a second battle of not just selling your solution and building it. It's also to actually do the licensing as well, especially when you're the first mover in that space. So where things like Logic Apps and Function Apps work really well is they may take longer to build. Well, not Logic Apps, but Function Apps especially. But then you've got like your million three executions on Function Apps, and you've got effectively low cost of Logic Apps. Especially things that aren't consumed that often. So sometimes it's a no-brainer just to go down to the Logic app level. So yeah, so I think if I was starting to pick one, I would invest a lot of time in Logic apps, I think, to be totally honest with you. Even if you are a developer, because I think even from my development background, you're very surprised about what you can actually achieve, in Logic apps. And I can't believe I'm particularly saying that as a like an kind of an ex-developer, but it is true. And but I think now, but it's kind of always been the case. But the realization for us is around that, having multiple technologies, I think, is the most powerful combination, to solution to the problem, if that makes sense.
yeah, I think it's just learning when to stop trying to do something in one of them because it's becoming too complex and moving
Exactly.
to
Yeah.
the next
Yeah.
tier.
Yeah.
'Cause I've been down that route.
Understanding where the bounds are to what you're using. Yeah, is really important. Yeah. Yeah. Without a doubt. And I don't think that's a science. I think that's an art, to be totally honest with you. To try and do it. So, okay. Well, hopefully, I'm gonna let's wrap this up because we've been on for an hour. So, but I think that should give you a good sort of overview of them. I think what we'll end up doing is we're doing some episodes around these different serverless products. So maybe we'll do like a combo logic apps with function apps, or something like some combo ones, to make sense, of specific scenarios. But yeah, if you've got any other questions or anything, just let us know, because it's been a big old topic this week, and hopefully you've got some valuable insight into these technologies. Alan, next episode, I think this is one of your babies. What are we going to be talking about?
Yep. So we're going to be looking into threat vulnerability management with Microsoft Defender for Endpoint (MDE). So it's been growing slowly, and there's been some new license queues, stuff like that. But we're going to talk about how it works and why you need it, kind of thing. So yeah.
Okay, cool. That'd be great. So yeah, if you've enjoyed this episode, please do consider subscribing if you'd like to listen to more of this sort of content in the future. We have many different topics that we'd like to cover, and your listens and support is what will continue to fuel the podcast going forward.
And as Sam said, if you have any feedback about this episode or the podcast in general, that we're doing well and things like that. The numbers say we're doing well, but without actually hearing from you, we don't know. There's a link in the show notes. If you click on that, then you can leave us some feedback for us, and we can consume that and change how we do our podcast.
Cool. Thanks very much, Alan, and thanks to everybody that's made it to the end of this episode. It's been a bit of a beast, so thanks for bearing with us. Cheers, everyone. Thank you.
Yep. Speak to you soon. Bye.